Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the GEM COVID-19 or Coronavirus Crisis online learning session. Quite an informal session where we will be discussing the lessons from the 2008 financial crisis. We've had quite a lot of people registering today, so we're really delighted, and probably most of you are joining us from home, as we all are. And we hope that you're keeping safe and well in this really troubled and difficult time. But you know, with difficult times, there's always things to learn. And with me today are Mark Hart, who is the GEM UK team leader. He's a professor at Aston Business School and Associate Director of the Aston Centre for Growth. And also Niels Bosma, who is actually the GEM Chair of the Board of Directors and GEM Senior Research Advisor from the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Department of the School of Economics at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Both Niels and Mark have long experience with GEM, and so they are very well placed to comment on some lessons from previous crises. Can you just change the slide first? Thank you. So for the benefit of anybody who really doesn't know what GEM is, I think it's very important for us to explain where does this research come from. GEM is a consortium of national country teams associating with top academic institutions, and our financing departments are mostly, but not only, governments. We carry out survey-based research on entrepreneurship worldwide. In fact, GEM is the only global research source that collects data on entrepreneurship directly from individual entrepreneurs, but also other adults and experts as well. Our adult population survey, for example, provides analysis on characteristics, motivations, and ambitions of individuals starting businesses, as well as social attitudes towards entrepreneurship. And then a second survey, National Expert Survey, looks at the national context in which individuals start businesses. This enables us to actually create tools and generate data that is extremely unique and that benefits numerous different stakeholder groups. If you could just change the slide. GEM has a long history. I've put up there is 21 years of robust research. We began in 1999 as a joint project between Babson College and London Business School. So this does mean that we have surveyed very, very many people. In fact, 3 million adults in 114 economies across the globe. Last year, for example, we carried out 150,000 interviews in 50 economies that participated in our research. We work with hundreds of specialists in entrepreneurship research and many, many academic and research institutions, as well as funding organizations. So can we just look now at what we're going to focus on? In fact, this is the first in a webinar series that we're hoping to generate. It's actually GEM's very first external webinar, and so we're actually delighted that it's so well attended today. Today we'll be looking at what GEM learnings from the 2008 financial crisis in particular can we apply to this crisis, this huge crisis that we're going to at the moment. And then we are going to be discussing how different this crisis is. During the rest of the series, and I'm hoping to tempt you, we'll be taking a veritable trip around the globe to take what I call an early temperature check on the COVID-19 crisis impact. As you probably have guessed from what I've said so far, we work with many teams around the globe, in Asia, in Latin America, in North America, in Europe, in Africa. And therefore we can actually draw on learnings from country teams across the globe. So we will be running individual webinars on different countries as we move along, every 2 weeks or so. And we'll keep you informed about those. Meanwhile, during 2020, we've been working hard on modifying our research surveys in order to carry out in-depth analysis on impact on coronavirus. This will allow us to accurate diagnosis and, as I call it, remedy prescription as economies recover, and we hope they will, from this crisis. If anything that we say here prompts your interest in maybe forming a GEM team or sponsoring one, the contacts are up on the screen there. Do check us out or contact me directly. No problem, we can answer any question you might have. So thank you very much for listening to that housekeeping. Now you know who we are, and I'm going to hand over to Niels, who will bring you through some of the headlines on what we would like to convey to you today. Thanks, Niels.
Yes, thank you very much, Aileen. Yes, as a startup, we would like to give you some taste of what the GEM data is about and how we can use them. As Aileen explained, there's a lot of data. There are many economies, countries involved. We also have a lot of indicators. So to simplify things, we took just 4 countries, as you see, and we will take only 3 indicators. So this will not be a very long lecture type of talk. I'm just giving you some taste of the indicators that are relevant in crisis that we actually saw also in 2009, and that we're about to see right now as well, when we collect more data. So you see, for instance, one indicator that we often use in GEM is the perception of business opportunity in the area that the adults live, the adults that are responding to our survey. So just to make sure, these are not necessarily entrepreneurs. These are random representative set of adults in every country. So they classify their country and see, they assess to what extent there's good opportunities in their environment to start a business. So if we can move this slide along, then we can see the development over time. We actually see, obviously, there was also, before this, there was already a crisis recession in 2001. This is not in the figure that much, but we see, for instance, when in the gray area, there was the economic slowdown of 2009, 2010, following the crisis in 2007. So there we actually see that the perceived opportunities in many of these countries declined. We actually also see some differences in the country responses. For instance, you see that the decline in the United States is observed first, then the other countries are following. We also see a relatively steep decline in Spain that was hit particularly hard by the financial and the subsequent economic crisis. So these are patterns that we see and that basically mirror the business cycle as we experience. So we can expect something similar to happen also in this year's data collection, a drop of the general perception of business opportunity, which obviously makes sense. The next step, and maybe we can go to the next slide as well, is to measure the intentions of adults to start new businesses. So people may have in mind to start a new business. They don't know exactly when that will take place. So this is still quite a generic measure. It's not measuring the actual startup activities, but the intentions to start a business in the next 3 years. So also for the same set of countries, we can develop this picture as it goes along the years. So maybe, Forrest, you can also show that development. What is important to measure here, because this is quite an important indicator that reflects potential new startups. But in a crisis like we see in 2009, 2011, for example, we see actually also a mix of entrepreneurial responses. First, you have the response of lower opportunities to start a business, the perceived opportunities. So people actually postpone starting up a business because they don't think this is the right moment. So that's basically a matter of timing. So we see the decline, and only after the crisis has been hit, you see a steep rise again in actually all 4 countries here. So this is really a clear result that we saw in 2011. But another aspect could be that actually due to the crisis, people are forced to start a business because they don't have another option. They might have been fired due to the crisis, though, so they might have lost their job, and actually there is no other opportunity. So in some countries, there's more necessity entrepreneurship. And then there's the third category, which basically goes against the first two options, is that people actually may see opportunities during a crisis, so they might be innovative. And when we asked additional questions in 2009, we actually saw that there was a subset of people that actually wanted to start new businesses because they saw new opportunities emerging from the crisis. These also tended to be quite innovative and ambition-oriented entrepreneurs. So that's quite interesting. Then we go to another, and this is the last measure that we will show here. So we also obviously measure the number of people who are starting a business and people who have a business that is quite new. So this is the early stage entrepreneurship indicator that we use, the TEA. So that represents startup activity, basically. So we have that, but we also identify the motivation that the entrepreneur has set for that. So it can be either necessity or opportunity in our data collection. So what we show here is the development in terms of necessity entrepreneurship over time. And also here we see some quite interesting developments. Again, the USA and Spain excel here in terms of an increase in necessity-based entrepreneurship. And whereas in the USA this declined quite quickly again, it remained quite high in Spain. So these are typically different developments that you see across countries. So it's not universal. It's not even though in some situations the crisis may be just as severe, we sometimes see different developments. We see the rates quite flat here for the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, for example. And we will go more in depth about the developments that we observed in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom later on in this webinar. So this gives a little bit of a taste of how we can see patterns of entrepreneurship, not only entrepreneurial activity, but also perceptions to entrepreneurship, how this differs across some of the economies on the globe. Like Aileen mentioned in the beginning, we have information for more than 100 economies across the globe. There's a lot of information in national reports of every country, which are available online on the GEM website as well. So you can have a look at those if you're interested in particular countries. We had to make a selection here to make the patterns clear. So I think this is a kickoff of to show what kind of developments we see using the GEM data in situations like a crisis. We saw some clear differences in the recession of 2009-2011. Yeah, and obviously it will be very interesting to monitor the changes this year, but also next year. Aileen, back to you.
Thank you, thank you. May I just mention that if some of what Niels has said intrigues you and you have some questions about it, and indeed if you have questions about anything else we yet have to say, please do put your questions in the chat room, and we'll endeavour to answer as many questions as possible before the end of the webinar. For now, I'd like to hand over to Mark. We have two countries that we want to look at in more detail here, the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. And Mark is going to show us what happened in the UK post-2008 and compare it with 2020. Over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aileen. For us, could we go back to the very first slide, please, while I make some introductory remarks? And if we just leave the finished version, would be good. Thank you very much indeed. I think in terms of the points I want to make, it's really just to dive a little bit deeper than the points that Niels has been making and with a focus on the UK. One of the general points I will make is that there was a big step change in the overall headline of entrepreneurial activity, or a pre-Great Recession, post-Great Recession. And I think that's basically part of the psyche of a lot of the not just let down, but very much marginalized as they lost their jobs, etc., etc. And as Niels has said, there's a rise in necessity entrepreneurship as a result of all of that. And I think it was certainly a case whereby people felt that they needed to take greater control of their own financial independence moving forward. And I think that's a lot to do with the UK story. But I think you can see here, obviously, we have the collapse of opportunities. And one of the points I wanted to try and tease out here is, what can we learn from this that we can apply to 2020 as we go through this particular, very, very much, a downturn is actually too mild a term. It's really a collapse of our economies in many senses. And I think it's important to bear in mind that this would be, your best case scenario of what's happening out there right at the moment. So I think it would be fair to say that we are seeing people sort of saying, look, there's not many opportunities out there. That's not to say that businesses, don't forget, we're talking about the general population here. That's not to say that businesses will not find opportunities in their marketplaces. I work with a lot of businesses who are beginning to pivot a lot of their business models, innovation of their business model to still maintain some revenue. I'm not sure it's for growth necessarily, but just to keep their business taking over. So there's a lot of opportunity there as we, as consumers working at home mostly, are beginning to perhaps, think about ways in which we should engage with the businesses we have in the past. I have a great supplier of gin from the Cotswolds who I used to pick it up on my way to the office. I now get a little package delivered to me on my doorstep, which is quite interesting. Okay, but seriously though, there will be a decline in opportunities. It does bounce back, and I think that's the good thing that we learned from the recession, that in the UK context in particular, it's a short-lived sense of, right, okay, I don't see many opportunities to start a business, but actually once the recession begins to be left behind, people do begin to look at opportunities. So again, it's a question of culture, context, which country we're talking about, whether and see that the bounce back is as sharp as what you see in front of you here. Spain, UK, US, Netherlands are very different contexts. They're all obviously from European Union point of view, but nevertheless, you can see there are differences here in terms of how people reacted. Perhaps remember what happened in that Great Recession period when we had the financial crisis. So if I can have the next slide, please, on intentions, please. Thanks very much. This is really important for us because we know there's a relationship between the people's intentions to set up a business and what happens further down the line. So whilst we, in the UK context, we found that other measures of entrepreneurial activity were holding up reasonably well. We saw that as part of the lag. People had already begun to take the first steps of setting up their business, and they're perhaps hanging on through the recession. But certainly intentions, people just closed down, didn't really want to be engaging in thinking about moving forward with their business. What we're seeing at the moment, and just to be clear, I'm using not the GEM data, because we will be going into the field in 2020 at some stage, but looking at other data sets, I can see a complete collapse in the number of businesses being registered, for example, in the UK. I have an article in the Financial Times this morning which refers to this. I look at some very early indications of what's happening with businesses being registered and actually dissolved or liquidated in the UK. And what we can see is that the incorporations are beginning to fall very rapidly since the beginning of March. So this is sort of daily data I'm picking up from Companies House in the UK. So we can see that people's intentions are beginning to, again, replicate what we saw in the Great Recession 12 years ago. So that's happening again. And also what we can see is the number of businesses going out of business has increased by about 70% in March 2020 compared to 12 months previously. So the question we've got is that, what's going to happen? We saw here in the UK a real kick up, as we saw in the Netherlands and in Spain, and obviously the US as well at a slightly higher level, in terms of the percentage of people who will intend to start a business. So again, it's part of this, let's be optimistic. Yes, we're going to have to see 2020 as a period whereby people will be postponing, delaying their decision to actually take the plunge and formally set up their business. So whether that's registration data or other things that we know from GEM work that There's a lot of people that do stuff before they actually get to registering a business formally that we can see have visibility on it. That's going to happen again. The scale of that, again, I would present this as your base case, worst case scenario, if you like. We'll see a collapse of this, but again, let's be positive about this. After the last recession, it bounced back. The question we've got here, why did it bounce back? Because there was recovery. The rest of the economy was functioning, if you like, and it began to pick up quicker. Therefore, I'm concerned at this time round, a lot of B2B, B2C businesses that perhaps struggle to pick up again. Revenues have collapsed for many businesses, and therefore it's very difficult perhaps to see the demand driving a lot of opportunities in the marketplace. It's a question mark, but certainly what we can see is there is some bounce back. And I'm old enough to remember recessions from the mid-70s, the early 80s, the early 90s. Bit of a pattern emerging here, the dot-com bubble, 8 years later. So there is a cyclical effect here. And we do get recovery. Businesses who survive and go, are established businesses, they tend to be more innovative. They tend to hold on to their staff and use it as a way of sort of thinking about their business model. And then finally, in terms of necessity, Forrest, if I could, again, what we saw here is, again, and Niels, you're going to pick up the story in more detail, but very different experiences here. But from a UK perspective, there was a gentle rise in necessity, which did not stop at the end of the recession. It continued right up to 2016, effectively. There's a bit of a sort of the volatility in the data, but nevertheless, it did continue to rise. What's that telling me? People talk about the UK recovery being very strong in terms of employment. Well, a lot of it's to do with self-employment, and a lot of it's to do with necessity self-employment. And again, thinking about that as part of what was driving, people remember the recession. They remember being exposed. So, again, out of necessity, they started their business, and that continued to be the case. So part of the recovery is perhaps types of entrepreneurship that, well, we tend to perhaps make that crude distinction between opportunity and necessity. And, the GEM project's evolved tremendously in recent years to have a more nuanced view in terms of, motivations to set up a business. But I think in terms of what we can see here is that, there is something different about these economies, and it's a lot to do with where's the safety net, and that's a point that Niels will be picking up. And again, that brings me into perhaps my final point, Aileen, with respect to policy. Where's policy going now? We know there's about 1 million self-employed at risk, given what's happening in various sectors, restaurants, hotels, pubs, inns, etc., etc. We've just been doing some work on that in the last couple of days. So we can see that 1 million self-employed at risk, but we've estimated in another piece of work, there's about 750,000 self-employed who are totally excluded from the government support for the self-employed. So in other words, there's still gaps in the support. There's also gaps with respect to existing businesses. But if we think about that support for self-employment, if there's a message there whereby the government's been slow as they were to recognize the importance of self-employment in the economy, don't forget there's over 4 million self-employed in the UK economy, then they perhaps will realize, well, look, when times get tough, we tend to be ignored. And when we look at also in terms of gender, ethnicity, there are particular marginalized groups who are also in the very recent entrance into self-employment who are being ignored. So one of the major components of the 750,000 that are outside policy are in fact those that were set up in business since April 2019. So you're giving very clear messages here that, well, we've taken the plunge. This government in the UK since 2010 has been celebrating entrepreneurship, enterprise, etc., etc. And at the first sign of a real fundamental downturn in the economy, they ignore us. That will not go away quickly. And I would worry that, in terms of this bounce back that we're talking about, there perhaps will be a fundamental legacy effect because of the support's not there. and it's not as comprehensive, and to be seen to be sorting out the larger small businesses first and ignoring the micros and the self-employed is a fundamental problem. That's enough from me for the moment. Aileen, back to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Mark. Well, we thought it would be interesting to just compare with another country now, and I invite Niels to give a perspective on the Netherlands. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, and yeah, really interesting to follow up on what Mark said also on the United Kingdom. Yeah, if we look at the figure that's now in front of you, you see that for instance, with the Netherlands, yeah, the necessity entrepreneurship only increased later on, so not directly after the crisis. This may have to do with the fact that there was quite a big stimulus from the government, quite a big support towards existing organizations, and most notably to the employees of these organizations. So there was a package that made it possible to be part-time unemployed and get part-time unemployment benefits, as we also see now happening in a lot of countries. So I think it had an effect in the sense that job losses were prevented to quite a high degree. So for that reason, we see fewer necessity-based entrepreneurship in the Netherlands in these years, but it increased afterwards. So it's also probably a postponed effect taking place here. But also for the Netherlands, and like every country, there are specifics. So that's, I think, also a very important lesson. And the Netherlands, there's also been changes in the labor market regulation, which made it more difficult to get a permanent job. So that had as a result that it was more attractive for employers to work with flexible labor, with freelancers, with gig workers, etc. So we saw a big increase there, and not every person who was involved in these types of activities did that because this was the first choice. So probably for that reason, we also saw an increase in necessity entrepreneurship in the Netherlands, even though it was still, compared to a lot of other countries, at a low level. Currently, we do see, so the first reports in the Netherlands are out as well. So Pantea, which is the organization in the Netherlands that does research on entrepreneurs and small and medium-sized businesses, have interviewed hundreds of entrepreneurs, and they already report a lot of turnover losses. Also, many of them will probably not survive. Even though also here there's still quite a big package from the government that stimulates businesses. But especially the small businesses and indeed the startups, they for them it's more difficult to tap into these resources, because they are especially aimed at businesses that can show that they decrease in terms of employment. And obviously for startups and for growing firms, this is very difficult to do. So this is kind of hindering entrepreneurship, and even the most promising types of entrepreneurship, because that's what the economy now needs. It needs to stimulate the promising types of entrepreneurship. So this is something that's typical to the case of the Netherlands. Obviously, so I'm not an expert on Spain, but we see probably that the implications are much more severe in terms of business losses and job losses. So that's something that we will probably also cover later on in another session. Aileen, back to you.
Thanks, Niels. We do actually have a comment from, I guess, someone in Spain, Francisco Linan. In Spain, 30% of self-employed have discontinued their activity in March 2020. True, they are the smallest SMEs, but it is nearly a third. Just a commentary on Spain. So you made some observations on policy. Do either of you, Mark and Niels, want to add anything on policy remedies post-crisis?
Well, I think if I can be brief and say that certainly from a UK European perspective, I see trillions of euros being spent on trying to rescue the business population. I think some have been quicker off the mark. Germany, for example, were handing out 50 billion euros worth of grants up front and then getting into the loans. UK did loans, basically asking firms to take debt. When you have revenues collapsing to almost zero, debt is not what business and entrepreneurs want to be thinking about. So policy levers are really important here, but it's also about, coming back to a lot of the work that GEM does about culture and the framework conditions for entrepreneurial activity. I think it's really important that a lot of the policy levers that are being pulled are giving the wrong signals to the wider population about how important it is when times get tough. From a UK perspective, being dragged screaming to the table to do stuff for the self-employed, for example, for the micro businesses, which are, as we know, 98, 99% of the business population. So I think there are issues there which will linger on for many years to come in that respect. But certainly the interventions are there. We can see them. How effective they are, time will tell in terms of have they been able to stabilize the particular, economic crisis that we see. In terms of the loans, we've had 330 billion sterling underwritten by government, and as we speak this morning, 6,000 loans at 1.5 billion. So a tiny proportion has actually been given out in the last 3 weeks, and that's just there's no appetite for it, and it's the wrong mechanism. So again, each country will have to really think hard about what's the right response to this.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Niels, would you like to add to that?
Yes, sure. So yeah, I'm really interested in. So obviously we now have the big relief programs, but there's a phase after this, which will be crucial, I think, because we will be shaping a new economy. And this is really what I'm interested to see. We have so many societal challenges ahead of us. Before Corona crisis, the climate crisis was a big issue. So that will come to the fore again. Well, in fact, we now see that in many countries, governments, business, and the wider community, they can collaborate, they can join forces and work on a societal challenge that is facing them. So yeah, I think it's very interesting to see the different policy responses from various countries in towards these societal challenges and how that plays out. For example, in Denmark, there is also the regulation right now that, okay, you can have support as a business, but not if you're making use of a tax haven, which is also interesting in the Dutch context, by the way, because we are known to be one of them. But that could be these kinds of measures could be very interesting to monitor over time and what kind of implications these have. And I think in that sense, yeah, the old saying, never waste a good crisis, really applies here.
I'm going to ask both of you, if you had to sort of shoot out some big headline messages to governments and indeed to entrepreneurs, what would they be? And also, secondly, what are the questions that you would like answered? Mark, maybe.
Well, I think what we the whole purpose of this is looking backwards. What did we learn? What we learned was that there are hundreds, thousands of entrepreneurs, individuals who are prepared to not be put off by an economic downturn. There's still activity takes place in the eye of the storm, so to speak, and that's going to continue to happen at the moment. I think it's going to be perhaps less than 12 years ago, but we don't have the data to know that for sure. I'm just giving you early signals about all of that, but certainly all of us about working with entrepreneurs and working and studying entrepreneurship. There are people there who will always be able to harness the resources and just get on with stuff. I think it's important that governments really begin to think about what sort of economy they're going to be trying to reboot in a year's time, 6 months' time. I think Niels is right that, we were looking at, a zero carbon economy. We were looking at whole implications of digitalization. Those things are still there, but I think the danger is that we'll get sucked into just a pretty pedestrian type of recovery and not thinking about those bigger questions, that they'll get ignored. That's my biggest fear. Yet I know from a UK perspective, there are entrepreneurs who are embracing the challenges of, Industry 4.0, digitalization, carbon neutral economies and businesses. And I think that we must make sure that that's embedded in any type of recovery, because we know we have got the entrepreneurial stock in many nations to be able to respond to these challenges. The recession did not kill entrepreneurship 12 years ago. And I don't believe COVID-19 crisis will kill it this time. It'll be a V, it'll be a very sharp V. But I do believe there's enough, there's that culture of seeking to be independent, if you like, which is still there. It's up to governments to create the framework conditions, to get the right levers. I'm not talking about massive subsidy here. Yes, at the moment, but I think it's about getting the right mechanisms to encourage that, if you like, that level of motivation to come forward again in 2021, 2022.
Oh, thank you, Mark and Niels. Niels, you in particular have also interest and expertise in social entrepreneurship and sustainability as one of mainstream concerns. And I'm just wondering whether you can comment on whether you see entrepreneurs grasping new opportunities to perhaps have purpose-focused businesses as well, maybe, and also any other observation you might like to make about overall takeaways from this.
Yeah, well, in general, I think that in many, and maybe even most businesses, this purpose is there, and you actually see also, some of the bigger established companies getting into action and with genuine concern and with the idea to help solving the problem. So I think this is something that's good to see, and also so there are some really remarkable new entrepreneurial activities coming up with entire new supply chains to get the health materials and equipment to the country. So I think these are amazing examples that we see, but we know that at some point, if you have a real shareholder value approach, that will come to the surface at some point, and so this is the main thing I think we have at hand right now. We have indeed a lot of social entrepreneurs that have as main priority to tackle a societal problem. But we also have businesses who are interested to contribute to that. So that needs to come together. And last year we had also in the US the round table results with the big companies exclaiming that they wanted to go for stakeholder value rather than shareholder value. Well, this is the momentum to pursue this, I would say. So now we need to, if anything, the time is right now to make these changes.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm actually switching over to have a look at some of the questions. We have a few minutes for questions. We have Owen who comments, it would be interesting to see comparisons with Global South countries. Has there been any analysis of that? Just to say that this is just the first in a series of webinars where we'll be looking at many different types of countries. We started off for sure with Europe, but we'll be going to Asia, Latin America, and other parts of the world. Would you like to comment on that, Mark or Niels? Or?
I think I would. I mean, the simple answer would be tune into the future webinars.
Exactly. The graphs shown, do they include self-employed people, or do they only show innovative entrepreneurial activity, hence innovative startups from
Niels is
LCO?
the master on the definitions. I'll leave it to him.
Yeah, well, the simple answer is no. So these, like I said at the beginning, these are three indicators we have. So so the first two indicators they are answered by a representative set of the adult population. So it could be you and me, everyone in this group, in this Zoom chat answering the survey. These are people who see business opportunities. That doesn't mean that they will pursue them themselves. Also, when it comes to intentions, a lot of people who have entrepreneurial intentions, myself, I have always entrepreneurial intentions. Somehow I never get to do it. I think there are many of those, and that's actually what you'll see also in the numbers. There's quite high percentages. But it's an important indicator, because entrepreneurship does come out of these intentions. Without intentions, there is limited entrepreneurship, even though that happens as well. And the final indicator we showed was the percentage of people who are involved in entrepreneurial activities, not necessarily innovative activities, who do that based on the necessity motivation. So for these figures, they don't focus on innovative orientation per se, or international orientation, or growth orientation, but these are all indicators that we do process in GEM. So if you read the GEM reports, you will also see data on that.
Okay, thanks. We actually have a few questions there on whether we can generate data about gender, and just like to point out, I mean, I'd actually encourage you to go to our website, and we have our global report, which has, you know, we really look at very many different variables, and we can actually carry out analysis on gender as well. So today we've really been focusing on certain very specific aspects, but have a look and watch the GEM space for the reaction gender-wise to the crisis also in 2020.
There's a question there about eco and social entrepreneurship. I'll kick off, and maybe Niels can come in as well, because I think that what we've seen, you know, my partner lives in France and I'm here in the UK, and we talk a lot about what's happening in our local areas, etc., etc. And I think that, you know, without putting too much of a gloss upon it, I think there's a feeling that you know, a lot of the larger companies, the food, you know, supermarkets, etc., etc., are very slow off the mark to respond to the needs of a lot of vulnerable people. And I think that there's a story emerging of you know, different ways of activity going forward. And I think that when we try, well, so what I meant earlier about trying to reboot the economy, it'll look different. It's not going back to normal. I think that maybe there is an opportunity here for the great social enterprises to really step up and really get engaged with a lot of the activity. I work with a lot of them across the UK, and they are really coming into the fore in terms of how they're responding to the needs of community. And also in terms of the types of entrepreneurs, we know from work we did in the UK that younger people, females and ethnic minorities are more likely to not just want to set up a business to create wealth, but to create meaning. And when we dig a little bit deeper, we get underneath the whole notion of, you know, social impact, environmental impact. So I think there is an opportunity here. And again, it's about the right levers and what government does to try and encourage more of that.
Yeah, I would totally agree with Mark here. I'm also a bit skeptical because also with the last crisis, we all said, well, this is the time we need to change, and so not much happened. So in that sense, even though there's an opportunity, there's also a danger that we will go back to normal. Well, if you see it as a danger, I do. So I think the opportunity is here, but it's also a call to not just the government and the business, but also all of us as consumers, as critical civilians, to have a look at what kind of businesses we all support. We do see that as a whole, it does matter what community, how community acts, and the big thing will be transparency. So financial transparency is one thing, but now it's about transparency in terms of what value do you create as an organization. So I think that will come to the fore more, and businesses will be held accountable more.
Mm-hmm. I've just one last question because we're reaching the end. What opportunities do you expect to see in the market when corona measures are getting less strict, based on your knowledge of the financial crisis, and which sectors do you expect to take off? And this is from else to young.
I think all bets are off. Aileen, in terms of what we can learn from the past, I mean, from a sector point of view, you know, I think that we've seen, well, one of the things we've seen here in the UK with our problems, and probably their global problems as well, with personal protection equipment for the health workers, that businesses have been very easily responded to changing their whole production, changing their whole business model overnight to respond to need. And I think that's quite interesting in terms of how we can get a more flexible economy out of this, responding to a whole range of needs that business owners, businesses that are not seen as, you know, I've set up a business, I'm going to continue to do that till I sell it or close it or whatever. So I think that flexibility, the agility that small business micros have is really quite interesting. So perhaps that's one thing from a sort of business model strategic point of view might come out of all of this. In terms of sectors, I think, you know, it's very difficult to predict. All I know is that looking back, you know, growth occurs in all sectors of the economy. It's not all about the sort of fancy high-tech stuff. And we hear a lot about life sciences and, you know, biological science, med tech at the moment, obviously, given the nature of the crisis. But I think it's the ways in which we will consume services in the future that's becoming more interesting. And certainly the education sector is really stepping up to think about homeschooling. So a lot of businesses I work with in, you know, educational services, they sell their things to the head teacher in a school. They're now having to think about how they can adapt their service to actually reaching out to children of all ages in home. And I think that's tremendous innovation. So I just, you know, I'm skeptical too, Niels, but I'm also hopeful that, you know, we'll see wonderful examples of the entrepreneurial spirit rising to that. And that's just examples of how we, you know, consume our services and how businesses are becoming more adaptable.
Okay, Niels, you get the last word.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, picking up on the last question. Obviously, yeah, it depends a lot on what the situation will be, right? In terms of social distancing, for example, and how long that will take, what kind of impact that has. Obviously, if you look at restaurants and hotels and the cultural sector, they will. Yeah, they will have a big blow. I expect. Yeah, at the same time, innovation will always happen, and also with these sectors, something will happen. We don't know now, but that's what innovation is about, right? That's also what we saw, at least in the early crisis, also in the 1920s, 1930s. Very new business models emerged. The whole point of the supermarket emerged in that era. So it's something we don't know yet. We know that entrepreneurship will always be there, and also there I'm also very positive. But we cannot really foresee where it will happen. That's the digital element will be very important. Is I think clear. We see that in education. We will see that more, and then also the ethics side of that will gain in importance, and then that's also obviously the role for the government to monitor this. So it will be for sure an era of a bit more uncertainty in that sense, and we'll see as time goes by and how this will play out. So this is, yeah, it's difficult obviously to predict, but that new developments will happen and that they will be economy-wide is also clear to me.
Great, thank you very much, Niels. And well, we will be providing the recording of this webinar, so don't hesitate to go back again and listen again. Also, if anything intrigues your interest here in terms of starting a national team in your country, we don't have a team in every country and we need more teams. It just makes the research more exciting and more robust, so please contact us. We also look at not only country level, but also ecosystem level, that is cities and regions. And we're very interested in hearing from sponsors, obviously, that are interested in sponsoring our research. Please look out for the next webinars. We'll be communicating those dates to you very shortly. And as I said, it'll be a virtual world tour. So you can't travel nowadays, travel with us. Thank you. And thank you to Mark and Niels for their time today.
Absolute pleasure. And if
Yeah,
anybody
thank you.
wants to follow up, contact through the office, and I'm happy to respond to any requests.
And same goes for me.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Keep well and safe and healthy.